Hi everyone. So my last podcast had to do with Zen, Chan, Vipassana, and mindfulness, which are the names of the four different meditation techniques that are popular in the States. And my point was that it's important to distinguish the technique from the concept behind the words, because the word itself is very general. For example, the word chan, or later on the Japanese pronunciation of that, Zen, is not necessarily just a sitting technique, but rather it really meant sedimentation, basically the purification of your mind. And so that's obviously very general to all facets of Buddhism. And similarly, the word Vipassana just means to explore, to view your mind. That again is very general. And finally, when we talk about mindfulness meditation, it's important to separate the technique from the concept of mindfulness, which is one of the Eightfold Paths, which obviously is the foundation for all Buddhist study. So today's talk, I'm going to switch gear a little and really talk about Zen meditation, especially when it's practiced in North America, particularly the Japanese Zen Center, and the technique that is practiced there versus the exercise that we use, what I call the mindful exercise, which are based on Master Jiro's teaching, what we call YJJ, Yujir. And so what I want to explore is in fact they are all part of yoga technique, which has a much deeper meaning than our everyday use, which when we talk about yoga, we typically talk about a collection of poses and standing, sitting. So these are very physical exercise. So I want to talk about yoga, or actually it's more original terminology, which I call Yujir, Yujr. But before I do that, I do want to go back to Zen or Chan, which was started by the first patriarch of the Chinese Zen meditation, Chinese Chan meditation, Bodhidharma. Right? This person actually exists. I mean, there's historical record of him. He is either a North Indian or Persian. He was supposed to be a prince, and then he became a monk, and then he traveled to China in the 5th century, 500 years after the birth of Jesus Christ. And he actually came to China from the south. So if you were to visit Canton, you would find historical sites where he had once lived. And then he eventually traveled and met with the Emperor Wu of the Liang dynasty, or we commonly just call him the Emperor Liang, which was one of the most important benefactors for the Chinese Buddhism. And there's actually historical record of that as well. And so there's a lot written about Bodhidharma, and of course Bodhidharma was meaning that he was the person who introduced the Zen meditation technique to China, and he was considered to be the first patriarch. And then eventually we have within 200 years we have the sixth patriarch, someone who I'm sure many of you know, a monk by the name of Wei Leng, who's very famous for the fact that he doesn't know how to read and write, and yet he really understood very deeply all the Buddha's teaching, which again sort of reiterate the point that Buddhism are not to be learned, but rather to be experienced. And often words are actually a hindrance to experience. And so this is the idea here, is that both the first patriarch Bodhidharma and the sixth patriarch Huilan emphasize the fact that much of Zen has to do with experience and not reading, not words. But in any case, Bodhidharma was also supposed to be the 28th patriarch of the Indian meditation technique, jhana. Right? The chan is actually came from the word jhana, and so the idea is that he was the last of the jhana practitioner in India, the 28th patriarch, and then he came to China and became the first patriarch of the Chinese tradition. And by the way, there's not really that much historical record of that. No one actually mentioned that he was 28 until much later after the fact. And now we just kind of took it as a given that he is 28. But there's actually almost no historical justification for that. But people don't question that. But the point is that if he were the 28th patriarch of the Indian tradition, who was the first? And so that part itself is also very famous. And so the first patriarch was a monk by the name of Kassapa, right? So if you don't know who that is, if you ever go to a Chinese Buddhist temple, and if you ever see the statue of the historical Buddha, there's typically two statues on the left and the right, which are his attendants, and one is the younger one. The younger one is Alanda, right? And the older one is Mahakassapa. So he is actually the most senior disciple of the historical Buddha. And so and there was a very famous story which is called the event is called the flower sermon, right? Or in Chinese, if you translate to Chinese, it literally means smiling while holding a flower. So the story is that one day Buddha was going to give a lecture, and but instead of start talking, he actually just sat there silently for quite a long time, and he was holding a lotus flower, a flower that was offered to him. He was just holding it with a very, very slight smile, and so which is very unusual. So the students are all confused by that. They didn't quite know what to make of it, and then and the only student in the audience was Mahakassapa, who just sat there and smiled back. And so there was the story was that there was a transmission of Dharma between Buddha and his most senior student, and the transmission was done without words, and that was the beginning of the jhana or the chan or the Zen meditation technique. And from now on, Mahakassapa was known as the first patriarch of the Indian tradition. Turns out that this story, however famous and popular it is, it was a complete invention, and it was written in a book almost 1,300 years later, for the first time, and it was written by a very famous Chan master in the Song dynasty, almost 600 years after the sixth patriarch, and it was written in it was written in a book called the Gateless Gate, or the Doorless Gate, and it was just one of the verses, and but before that there were no historical record. So but that doesn't matter. That's the point. That's the legend. The legend was that the first patriarch was the most senior student of Buddha. Buddha transmitted the Dharma to him without using words, and then he eventually transmit that to Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma took it to China, and then eventually the sixth patriarch inherit that. And then from there, that's when the Chan tradition became very popular, and there was 5 different branches, and one of which is called Soto, and was brought to Japan and became Zen meditation. Okay, so that was the story. But there were, but the part that's and whatever you like, I mean, whether or not you believe that that is true or not doesn't really matter. That is the legend. But there's one fact that I think there's almost no dispute, which is that Bodhidharma had to be a yoga master, had to be a yogi, because he came from North India, and yoga was practiced in India at the time. Okay, so now yoga is an English pronunciation of a very, very old technique called Yujir, Y-U-J-I-R, or Y-U-J. But eventually, yoga was brought to the West, sort of in the late 1800s, the late 19th century, early 2000, by a very famous yogi named Swami Vivekananda. And then eventually it became very popular, and eventually yoga became a physical fitness, stress relief, and relaxation technique that is based on postures, what we call asanas. And that's it. That's what we know. That's all we know about yoga, right? But in fact, yoga is an Indian tradition, and it's much more than physical exercise. In India, it's actually a meditation and spiritual technique. It is, in fact, one of the 6 major spiritual schools, which all kind of fall under the umbrella of Hinduism. And yoga, or yuja, actually predated Buddhism. It actually already exists before Buddha was born, 600 BC. And it actually never disappeared. It actually coexists with Buddhism. In fact, I argue that yuja, or yoga, is an integral part of Buddhism. And yoga basically means be one with the Brahman, or and just step back in talking about what is Brahman, right? Brahman, the Brahman king, right? Remember? And so we talk about the 3 realms. Our universe can be divided into the 3 realms, remember? And I talk about how the 3 realms is actually very consistent with general relativity, in that time is relative. That one part of the universe could have different time than another part of the universe, and that according to general relativity, E equal mc squared, all matters are also energy. It's just another form of energy. So one can then relate time with material. The more material, the slower the time. In fact, you can argue that material is in fact a contamination of energy. Contamination is a spiritual energy. So if you were to think like that, then you can divide up your universe in terms of purity, right? The most spiritually pure part of the universe actually has no time. And that's consistent with the singularity in the black hole. And beyond that, universe will have time. And so if you were to kind of look at it this way, then you can easily divide it into 3 realms. And the lowest realm, the one that has the slowest clock, the most material contaminations, desire contamination, is called a desire realm, and that's where we preside. And we talk about within that you can have different form: human, animal, hungry ghost, hell, which are the lower forms, and then above you could have the devas. Okay, and then beyond the desire realm, then you get into what's called the form realm, or the form realm. The first of the form realm is called the Brahma, and so you can understand then that this traditional technique, spiritual training technique in North India, the one that we call yoga, or historically called Yujir, is actually one where the practitioners are trying to decontaminate itself so that they can escape samsara and be out of the desire realm and enter into the form realm. And the first of the form realm is the Brahman, is where the Brahman would reside. And so Yujir meant be one with the Brahman. That's what it means. That it's a desire, it's a technique that allows you to escape the desire realm and enter into the form realm and to live in eternity. And so it's actually really interesting then to look at some of the literature of the Yujir technique. And so one of the famous sutra in the 5th century before Christ, around the time when Buddha, the historical Buddha, was born, when translated into English, it says, when the 5 senses, along with the mind. So now you're talking about the 6 sense roots, right? All of our physical organs. The 5 senses are the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, this body, the skin, and the mind. So it says, when the 5 senses, along with the mind, remain still, and the intellect is not active. Intellect is not active means that if you think about the mind root, it has 2 parts, right? It has the physical part and the spiritual part. The physical part is your cerebral. That's your big brain. That's your intellect, right? So when Master teaches us, he always talks about no thinking. Just be present with your breath, but don't think, don't feel, right? So it says that when the 5 senses, along with the mind, remain still, and the intellect is not active, that is known as the highest spiritual states. That's when you start to escape the 5 hindrances, and now you became a stream enterer, and you're approaching the Brahman realm. So then they continue. They said, so they continue and they elaborate and says, we consider yoga or Yujir to be firm restraint of the senses. Then one becomes undistracted. One becomes undistracted in the arising and passing away. So this is really interesting, right? Because when Master Yujir talks about our contemplation, he talks about contemplating your body, right? So when we talk about the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the first one has to do with the mindfulness of the body, the Gaya Upasana. He's talking about contemplating the body, the 4 elements, contemplating the mind and the form and the name, and then he finally talks about contemplating the rising and the falling. And so this is actually this section in this very famous Yoga Sutra in the 5th century, one called Kapha, Katha, Upan, I don't know how to pronounce it, Upanishad, okay, Upanishad. You can look it up. It was written or was passed down, supposed to attribute to back in 5th century BC. I doubt that there was written language yet at that time. It talks about everything that we talk about, right? Which is that ultimately it's about the contemplation of the rising and falling of your breath, and then later on your mental formation. And the idea is that if you could be undistracted by the rising and falling, then you have in fact escaped the desire realm. Very interesting. So all I'm saying is that so far, yuja or yoga is very consistent with the Buddhist teaching, and again, there's another part, another part that I pull out, which is written about 300 years later, about the 2nd century BC. It just basically says that yoga or yuja is said to be equanimity. Okay? And that what we call yoga is the separation from contact meaning the 6 senses, with suffering, right? If you escape the 5 hindrances, that's the end of your dukkha. So that's all very, very interesting. That number one, that Bodhidharma, the first patriarch of Chan, or the first patriarch of Zen, he had to be a yogi master, right? Because that was practiced in India at the time, so he had to be one. And that what he was teaching is very, what we consider Buddhist teaching is actually very consistent with the Yuja teaching. So one of the stories that I want to mention about Bodhidharma, which might not be historical, but I like the story anyway, was that after he met with Emperor Liang, and it wasn't a good meeting, he decided that there was really no place for him in the court. And so he left and he arrived at what is now known as the Shaolin Temple. And when he arrived at the temple, he saw a bunch of monks getting into a chamber, so he followed. And then when he get inside the chamber, he noticed that all the monks were sitting, meditating. So he asked them, he says, what are you doing? He says, oh, we're meditating. Why do you meditate? Oh, we want to become Buddha. We want to become a Wiccan. So he said, okay. So he picked up a rock and he started polishing it on the table. And so the monks all look at him. He says, what are you doing, master? He says, well, I'm polishing a mirror. And all the other monks says, how could you polish a mirror? How could you take a rock and make a mirror out of a rock? And he says, well, if you could become Buddha by sitting, why can't I polish a mirror out of a rock? The point is that I believe Buddha Dhamma saw something, that there was something wrong with the practice. And in fact, I believe that he felt that by pure sitting, one of the problems with just pure sitting is that pretty soon your body become a major hindrance, right? A major barrier to your practice. And I believe he was determined to apply his yoga or yuja practice to strengthen the body, and then to draw attention to the body as a prerequisite for calming the senses, calming the mind. I believe that is true because that's my own experience, and that's actually Master Jiwu's teaching. And so, supposedly he went into seclusion for 9 years, and then when he came out, he left behind 2 sets of writing, 2 sets of practices. Actually, I'm not sure it was writing. I think that was more pictorial description of his technique. But before I talk about the 2, one of which is Yi Jing Jing, I do want to go back to the original, the traditional yuja or yoga technique, right? And so a very famous sutra, Yoga Sutra, is the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, which was compiled about 400 years after birth of Jesus, 400 years in the Common Era, which by that time, by the way, Buddhism had pretty much died out in India, right? That that the center for Buddhism had moved. Well, it had first moved to Pakistan, and then of course that died out too because of the invasion of the Muslims, and then eventually went to China. And so 400 AD, for Common Era, is when Buddhism had already completely died out in India. And the sutra, the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali actually talks about the eight limbs of yoga practice. So the 8 limbs of yoga practice is kind of like the Eightfold Path. You know, when you think about the Eightfold Path, you have it's like a wheel with the eight different spines, and mindfulness, right concentration, you know, like that is the Eightfold Path of Buddhism. So this is sort of like that. It's the 8 limbs of Yujir. And so I just want to mention that that there are four of which we're actually quite familiar with. One is asanas. Asanas just mean postures, right? And so that branch of yoga is called hatha yoga, and that's what we practice, commonly in the West. Okay, so this is like the 5 blind person looking at elephant. Each one kind of look at one piece of it, where in fact all of which are embodied in the ancient Yujir teaching. One of that is the asanas, is the hatha yoga. The other one is jhana. Okay, that's the sentimentation. That's what we're talking about. That's jhana. That's chan. That's yoga. That's Zen. The third one is called samadhi. Okay, and the fourth one is called pranayama. That actually another way to talk about it is the anapanasati. It's about breathing. So actually just the 4 out of the 8. The other 4 is much harder to understand, but just the one that I understand, the 4 are in fact the different technique that we talk about. The Zen technique, the mindfulness technique. Yeah, so people talk about mindfulness. When people talk about mindfulness technique, they talk about anapanasati, the breathing, and samadhi, which is kind of like the chan technique, if you will, kind of just sit and concentrate, and then the yoga is known in the West. But anyway, go back to the 2 techniques that was left behind by Bodhidharma, which I believe the purpose of which was to introduce the body. Okay, introduce the body and not let the body become a hindrance, but rather use the body as a tool for Zen meditation, for Chan meditation. So the first technique supposedly is the Yi Jing Jing. And Yi Jing Jing, by the way, not sure if you recognize it, but Yi Jing sounds a whole lot like Yujia. Okay, but Yi Jing actually in Chinese means the changing or the renewal of tendon. Okay, but there's another one called the Xi Sui Jing. So one is called YJJ, one is called SJJ. Xi Sui Jing is XSJ. So Xi Sui Jing is another method, and the Xi means to wash or to cleanse, and Sui means the marrow. And so it's essentially talking about the cleansing or the renewal of both the tendon and the marrow, okay, which are very important part of the body, as you can imagine. So, so I want to talk. So right now, supposedly these 2 techniques has been lost, right? So there's no historical way of finding out what we're doing is in fact the 2 techniques that are left behind by Bodhidharma, right? You can't find hard data on that. However, if you look at YouTube, you can find 3 different versions of what is claimed to be YJJ, Yi Jing Jing, or Xi Sui Jing. Okay, so the one technique, of course, is the one that was taught by Master Yujir, which, by the way, is not practiced by anyone else. It's only practiced by master and his student, namely me and you. But there's one that's claimed to be YJJ. It's practiced mainly in mainland China, but they look a whole lot like what's called the 8 brocade practice, and I'm not going to go into that too much, but it's a technique that is actually sanctioned by the Communist government of China. And when I look at it, I understand that it's good for your body. I understand that. It looks a lot like Tai Chi and all that. But I just couldn't see how it could help me in meditation. Okay? So the two that I use, besides the one from Master Jiru, is the one that is popular in Taiwan. And in fact, the one that is popular in Taiwan, if you study it, the first act is actually very popular. It's called the swinging arm exercise. And if you go to the park in San Francisco or anywhere else, you will see all these Chinese elderlies doing that. And supposedly this technique was actually transmitted outside of Shaolin Temple in the 16th century. And then it went everywhere in the world, and then eventually went to Vietnam, and then from Vietnam it went to Taiwan. So this one is very popular in Taiwan, and I actually incorporated that into my Friday night exercise, and then also my Wednesday morning class. But the one that we learned, the main one, the YJJ that we learned from Master, actually also has a very interesting history. It was supposed to be something that was taught to Master by his grandfather, who actually practiced Shaolin martial art, and he started learning that when he was 5 years old, and didn't think much of it. And then eventually, when Master came to America, he was actually invited by a number of monks in the East Coast, one of which is a master by the name of Ming Chi, who was actually the chairman of the American Buddhist Society in New York. And he got to know Ming Chi, Venerable Ming Chi very well. Master got to know him very well. And so one day, the story was that, as told by Master, was that Master Ming Chi asked Master Jiru, told Master Jiru that he's ready to transmit a set of exercise to him. So he showed Master Jiru, and then afterwards, Master Jiru immediately repeat the exercise, and Master Ming Chi was very surprised that Master Jiru could learn so quick. And Master Jiru says that, well, this is the same that I was taught by my grandfather. So Master Ming Chi said that, well, this is actually something that they transmit from abbot to abbot. Is the technique that they use when they're in seclusion, to strengthen their body and to draw attention to the body. Now, Venerable Ming Chi was, before he came to Hong Kong, before he escaped Communist China in 1949, and then after he escaped, he went to China, and then went eventually from China to Taiwan to North America. Before he escaped communism, he was actually the 48th abbot of the Tinling Temple. Okay, and Tinling Temple, which actually started by a monk, was actually started by a monk called Fa Yong. And Fa Yong, Venerable Fa Yong, is actually very famous. He's actually the founder of another branch of Chan meditation. But Venerable Fa Yong was actually a student of Venerable Dao Xing. Venerable Fa Yong was the founder of the Tinling Temple, but he himself was a student of Venerable Dao Xing. And Venerable Dao Xing was the 4th patriarch of Chan, right? So he was actually the 4th generation student of Bodhidharma. So I have strong belief, other than my own experience and my own benefit for practicing Yujing and my own testament on how Yujing helped my practice. I have reason to believe that this is probably came from Bodhidharma. So those are the two that I kind of mix and match and into my my exercise routine. And if you go to the web, go to our channel, you will see it. We actually do record that every Friday afternoon, and that's the basis. Those two are the basis for this set of routine. So thank you very much. I'll see you next week.